My name is Alicia Middleman. I'm a curator at the Estes Park Museum. Today is January 8th, 2014. We're at the Estes Park Museum interviewing Bernard Gillett for the Estes Valley Mountaineering Oral History Project, a joint venture between the Estes Valley Library and the Estes Park Museum. What is your full name?
Bernard John Gillett.
And when and where were you born, Bernard?
I was born in Wausau, Wisconsin in 1967, January 30th.
And when did you begin rock climbing?
I was about 10 years old when that started, and there was a history that preceded that, of course, partly from the family, but also just my childhood. So I'll start with going all the way back to 1913, 2 years before Rocky Mountain National Park was created. My grandmother on my father's side and her sister, Eunice was Aunt Eunice, great Aunt Eunice, and then Leah Sweat was my grandmother. They were members of the Colorado Mountain Club, and they climbed Long's Peak. They were living in Denver at the time. They climbed Long's Peak in 1913. So that was, some of the early ascents of Long's Peak, really. Of course, it had been climbed 50 years before, but I don't think it was a real popular thing to do. And certainly not for women at the time. So that began my family's involvement with Rocky Mountain National Park. And then my father, his parents took them to Estes Park during the summertime. They'd spend 2 or 3 weeks up at the Dings Cabin, which is this old cabin right at the foot of Rocky Mountain right at the foot of Long's Peak, off of Highway 7 there. I was driving by it just the other day, and it's still there. Still says Dings on it. So he spent his summer vacations, short ones, in that cabin and climbed Long's Peak as a teenager. And then later on, as an adult, he brought the family, my family, out to Estes Park in the summertime. He was a college professor of mathematics, so he had the entire summer off. And I think the first time I came to Colorado was in 1967, the year that I was born. I was 6 months old, and we spent a couple of weeks here. The only reason I know that is family slides. And then we visited again when I was 4 years old, so that'd be 1971. And then beginning in 1974, my family came out here for the entire 3 months of the summer. So I grew up a quarter of my life in Estes Park. And the basic plan of action all summer long was just hike as much as we could. My parents maintained a little hiking list on the refrigerator that had all the kids' names on it and their names. And as the summer progressed, we got to Mills Lake and Black Lake and climbed Twin Sisters and Flat Top and Long's Peak. I climbed Long's Peak first when I was 9 years old. So somewhere in there, my older brother and I, just were attracted to more difficult scrambling. And I can point to 3 or 4 people or places or items that brought us to rock climbing. And the first of those, I would say, is the fact that in 1977, we rented a one-room cabin, the Menard Cabins up on Riverside Drive. And our neighbor just happened to be Ray Northcutt, who is one of the more famous climbers around here. His son, Eric, was a little bit older than my older brother, John, but as neighbors, we became playmates. And Ray and his wife, Nancy, became friends of my parents. So we learned about rock climbing through Mr. Northcutt, as he was known back then. And in fact, I've got a little book here, that Long's Peak, Its Story and a Climbing Guide. This is the early guide that a lot of people bought. It was written by Paul Nesbitt, and it's signed by Ray Northcutt. He signed this, I think, a few years after we met him and knew about his climbing. But we also have it signed by Dave Rearick and Bob Camps. They were, of course, instrumental in the history of climbing the Diamond. They were the first to climb the Diamond. And I think it was 1991 that Jim Detterline put together the Long's Peak Symposium. So a bunch of people associated with climbing on Long's Peak were gathered, and Camps and Rearick were among those. And they actually stayed in our house. Leighton, of course, slept in my bed because he was also part of that. The reason our house was kind of open was because my sister at the time was a Long's Peak Ranger. So, but that's skipping ahead a little bit. again, we were neighbors with Ray Northcutt, and Eric, his son, and my older brother John and I did a little bit of scrambling around on the rocks nearby, Rock Acres in particular. There's condos there now. There didn't used to be anything there. And then as time went on, and John and I, again, just were rubbing shoulders with the rock climbers in the area, probably mostly because we would go to Camito Boots just about every summer to get new boots for all the kids for hiking. And Fantasy Ridge was housed in the same building that Camito had his shop in. So John and I would go talk to the climbing guides up there. Then there's another book I'd like to show that was really influential in our choice to climb. And that's this book called Climb by Godfrey and Shelton. It's a very, very well done history of rock climbing in Colorado. So my parents bought this, not this actual copy, this is my copy. They had a hardcover copy, and they bought it as a coffee table book. John and I pored over those pictures just endlessly, particularly in the cold winters in Wisconsin. And that really drew us to, we want to do this. As a matter of fact, there are a few passages in this book that I could call up John right now and say, for example, if Buell thought that and he could finish my sentence, then we did. Or the big walls, he could say the big walls, because that was one of the phrases that they used in interviewing Leighton Core. Another one would be lots of energy in, and my brother would instantly say lettuce, because again, stories about Leighton Core that are in this book. So we decided we better become climbers, just because we thought all this was really neat. And we were still pretty young, 10 years old in 1977. That was me, and my older brother was 12. But we started to accumulate a little bit of rock climbing gear from the used gear box at Fantasy Ridge. The guides would sometimes sell their gear. And we bought a little 20-foot rope, if you can imagine. That was our the size of our rope. We had, and it was an 8mm rope. It was essentially accessory cord, but it was our first climbing rope. And then we bought about 4 chocks, just straight-sided stoppers, maybe a hexcentric. In fact, one of the hexcentrics that I think we'll look at after this interview, it's got COV stamped in it, and that was Covington, Michael Covington. And he was one of the heroes in this region, and he was certainly one of our heroes. Basically, anybody that was working at Fantasy Ridge was, we looked up, we figured that these are the giants of climbing in Estes Park. So to have a chalk, one of our early chalks that had Michael Covington on it, that thing had been places for sure. We bought some carabiners and some webbing to fashion harnesses from, and slowly started to use this stuff. There's a picture I'll show you later of John and I rappelling out of a tree in Wisconsin. So we, just taught ourselves how to do this. It was Royal Robbins' books. He had Learning How to Rock Climb, Basic Rockcraft, that was one of them, and Advanced Rockcraft. We bought those 2 books and read the pages, just religiously over and over until we could figure out how to do this. And we asked questions of the guides at Fantasy Ridge too. But it was a very slow process, for sure. Again, we were very young kids. So we didn't do a whole lot with the gear that we had accumulated up to that point. My parents, though, they could see that we were moving toward wanting to be, true rock climbers. So they decided to enroll in a class, Basic Rock. That was one of the classes that was offered at Fantasy Ridge. And this was 1978, I believe. They wanted to try rock climbing themselves before they let their kids, get into the sport. And it wasn't until a number of years later that we discovered their guide for the day was John Backer, who was, at that time, one of the most famous American climbers. Still is one of the most famous American climbers. Of course, he's deceased now. But so just to know that my parents climbed with John Backer, and all these weird things, being a neighbor with Ray Northcutt, bumping shoulders with the greats at Fantasy Ridge, it almost was though, we were meant to be climbers. And after that climbing class, my parents decided we were too young, so we couldn't, really do anything with it. But we started bouldering a little bit on hikes. I can picture in my mind's eye this boulder off the trail near the Glacier Gorge parking lot. That was one of our first conquests, if you will. It's 12 feet high, but I remember just being terrified getting to the top of it. And then figuring out, how are we going to get down from this thing? and as my parents were watching us toy around with this, there was another climb just off of the trail that goes up to Nymph Lake. And no, it's just above Nymph Lake. So you get to Nymph Lake from Bear Lake, and then the trail goes around and it's rising up to Dream Lake. And there's some slabs off on the right that are maybe 30, 40 feet high, and they're very low angle. They're probably third class. But John and I climbed those, I think with our 20-foot rope. We may have free soloed it, but I also think we may have had our rope along. And my parents were not really happy, watching this unfold. They had agreed that we could try it, but I think they didn't really like watching their boys get into a dangerous spot. So, like I said, they were a little bit cautious about letting us get into rock climbing. And it wasn't until 1980 that we finally convinced them we were ready for it. And we ended up ordering a bunch of gear. We were in Wisconsin preparing to come out to Colorado for another summer. We ordered a bunch of gear from REI, 20 carabiners, some stoppers, some hexcentrics, some webbing for harnesses. I don't think we bought harnesses for quite a while. We didn't get rock shoes either, but we must have ordered a rope. So we ordered all this stuff. We were ready to jump into climbing. And then my dad got sick that spring, actually. He had some thyroid problems and ended up being hospitalized, and we canceled our trip to Estes Park that summer. So we took all of our gear and sent it back to REI and got our money back. It might have been our guardian angels that were looking out for us at that point, because had we gone to Estes Park as planned, I would have been 13 years old, John was 15, and we would have started climbing for real. And that might have been a little bit too young for two boys that were just trying to figure it out on their own. We didn't take any classes or anything like that. Again, we had the Fantasy Ridge guides to ask questions about. And we did have those instructional books by Robbins, but we learned how to climb on our own 2 years later when we eventually convinced my mom and dad. Actually, I think it was 3 years later. It was 1983, and we convinced my mom and dad to buy us a rope. And my dad actually had some interest in getting us into climbing because he wanted to take the family up the cables on Long's Peak on the north face. And he had climbed the cables as a kid, but of course they were taken down, I think, in the early 70s. So the keyhole route was the normal route. But John and I got this gold line rope from Steve Comito from his shop. And kern mantle ropes were definitely available. I think, if I remember.
What kind is that?
A kern mantle rope. That's the kind of ropes that we climb on these days. Those were available, I think, in the late 60s. They're the standard nylon rope with a core and then a mantle over them. But we bought this gold line, which was sort of a throwback to the 50s almost. And I wonder, just looking back at it, whether Comito had this rope in his shop for 12, 15 years and it never sold. And we were just the kids that he decided he'd dump this rope on. But that was our first rope. And we took it out, I think it was the Thumb up on Prospect Mountain. That was our first climb ever that we could call a true climb. Again, that 20-foot rope, we did some things near Mary's Lake. We rappelled off Churchill Boulder with that 20-foot rope and some of the other things that I've already mentioned. But our first real climb was on the Thumb. And I don't even know if we had a guidebook. We might have just had a recommendation from the Fantasy Ridge guys to go climb, see whether or not we could get to the top. But that climb, I don't remember much of the details, but I remember a few details that really stand out. One in particular, I led the first pitch, and it was about fourth class. I took my kids up that actually just this fall, so I was trying to remember exactly where I went so many years ago. And there was this little pod in the rock face that I decided I'd belay at. And it was maybe 10 feet below this huge ledge. An obvious ledge to anybody that had been climbing a long time, but I just didn't even see it. So I belayed in this tiny little pod, and I belayed with a single, I think it was a number 4 stopper. Again, I just see this in my mind's eye. It was one of the few pieces of gear that we had. My brother got up to me and was terrified that I was belaying off of one piece of gear that was poorly placed. And he saw the ledge above us, and he decided he'd lead up to that ledge. So he led this very short 10, 15-foot pitch and brought me up. And then we traversed around the ledge. And I don't know when we started this climb, because I've got some notes that go all the way back to that era. I've been keeping a diary of my climbs for the last 33 years. So I looked at some of those notes in preparation for this interview. And it says that we retreated because it got dark. So that may be the case, but I also have a memory that we retreated just because we were too scared to go on. And the reason I brought up, I'm not sure when we started the climb. We could have started the climb at 4 in the afternoon, and it might have taken us 3 hours just to get to that point because we were so slow, and every step of the way was horrifying. We ended up rappelling, though, off of this boulder that I think had a sling on it. Maybe we left our own sling. Again, just looking back at that and returning to that boulder 30 years later and realizing that I can move it, it's scary to think of what we did when we were kids. But I guess we were lightweight, and the boulder was fine. So we came back to that climb a couple days later. We were living on Ranch Circle. My parents had purchased a summer home at that point, and it was a natural place for us to climb. And we ended up making it to the summit. So that was our first, success, I guess.
What route was that?
It's not even a named route. It starts between the thumb and what is now called the thimble. It's on the south side, the south edge? I mean, I could show it to you, but it's not in my guidebook. It's just this easiest way to get up the thumb. It ends in the west chimney, if I'm not mistaken, and that is something that's described in one of my guidebooks. So after that success, I think we climbed the Needle shortly thereafter, just the 4th class route up the Needle, or it might be rated 5.0 these days. And then we got our first guidebook. We purchased this guidebook from Comito's shop. It was written by Richard Dumais. Any of these guys that had written a guidebook or whose name was in a guidebook, we regarded all of these people in the climbing community as our heroes. We hadn't really met them. Well, a few of them we had met, but we certainly didn't know them as children. And this guidebook it can be described only as a joke. It was this tiny little book that was about 3 inches by 5 inches, maybe 30 pages, and it gave very scant information about some climbs at Lumpy Ridge and some climbs, I think, in Rocky Mountain National Park. The topo for the book was literally just a scribble that maybe outlined the book formation, and then a J crack, and then the Howling at the Wind dihedral, maybe a couple of lines for the pages wall, and that was it. Again, a very scant couple of paragraphs to describe the route Osiris. And then over on the Twin Owls, again, the topo was just hilariously bad, just Twin Owls, and here's the central chimney, there's the crack of fear. I wish I could show you the book. It's my brother's book, so he's got it back in Wisconsin. But that book was what took us to the mountains, took us to Lumpy Ridge. So our first route at Lumpy Ridge, probably recommended to us by the Fantasy Ridge guides, was Oregon Pipes on the Twin Owls, and this would have been 1984. I realize I'm actually just skipped over the end of 1983. Let me backtrack, actually. After the success of climbing the Thumb and the Needle, my parents decided we knew enough about climbing that we could do what my dad wanted to, and that is take the family up the north face of Long's Peak. So we all hiked up to the cable route, and John and I led the thing. I can't even remember, which of my family members were around. I doubt it was the whole family because I come from a pretty big family. There's 8 kids and my mom and dad. But my guess is my mom and dad were along, certainly John and I, and probably my older sisters, Maria and Joan. And then my younger brother and sister, Robert and Mary, they probably didn't come along on that. And then my older sisters beyond that, Pat and Ann, they actually weren't with us for many of those summers because they were older than the 6 children that my mom and dad had. My dad was married to his first wife for 7 or 8 years and had 2 kids, and then she ended up dying, actually in a tragic accident in Rocky Mountain National Park. She slipped down Tyndall Glacier when they were descending from Hallett, and died, I think it was in 1957. So it's surprising to me to know that is part of my father's history, because he was hiking with her, and she slid several hundred feet and landed in some rocks. That he continued to come to the mountains and take his family out into the mountains. But it was part of his family tradition, and he was very much a mountaineer his whole life, at least a strong hiker. He did some climbing later, but it's surprising that that he let his young boys go learn climbing. Anyway, we went up to the North Face and successfully climbed up the cables and summited Long's Peak. I would have been 16 years old, I think, and John would have been 18 at this point. So then it was the next year, 1984, that we started climbing at Lumpy Ridge and climbed Oregon Pipes, as I mentioned. And then our next big climb at Lumpy Ridge was Osiris on the book, again with that lousy topo, but somehow we found the route. It took us 3 attempts. I believe the first time we went out there, we got done with the first pitch and we were just thoroughly exhausted, so we rappelled off. And the second time, we got up 2 pitches, and I think we were starting up the 3rd pitch, and it started to rain, so we had the down climb. If I'm remembering correctly, John was leading that pitch. It was the crux pitch, and he was nearing the crux when it started to rain, and he down climbed the whole pitch. And that's, that was actually part of the tradition of climbing back then, I think, that you down climbed a lot more. If you got yourself into trouble and a spot that you weren't able to get past, you just down climb and come back another day. Certainly, you might also rappel off of a piece of gear, but the little gear that John and I owned was very precious to us, and we bought it with our allowance money. So it was kind of unthinkable to leave a piece of gear. The 3rd time that we came back to Osiris, we were able to get all the way to the top. I was climbing in a pair of Kletter shoes that were really my hiking boots, bought at Camitos. John was climbing in basketball shoes. We did not have rock climbing shoes. We didn't have the money for it. It might have been I think it was the end of 1984 that we finally, so I guess the end of that first long summer climbing that we did get some rock shoes. John was working as a busboy perhaps in a restaurant, and I wasn't working yet. I was just, goofing around in the summers. And my mom bought me a pair of shoes, and John bought shoes from his own work money. I think mine were a pair of Solos, ASOLO, and then John bought some EBs, which were the shoe of the day. By the time 1984 came to an end, we had climbed, many pitches of 5.6, 5.7, 5.8. We were just starting to get into 5.9, and we aspired to climb the Petit Grépon, and that was a 50 classic climb of North America. That book was another book that we purchased early on in our climbing career, and that we just, spent endless hours reading about all the different classic climbs around the country. So we got up Petit Grépon, and my mom, in celebration of that event, went down to the local t-shirt shop and made us these Petit Grépon sweatshirts, actually. She showed him a picture of the Petit Grépon that we had taken, and they fashioned a little design and stamped it on our shirts. So we have this really cool memento of that climb from 1984. It's with me today. I'll show it to you later.
Did you bivvy beforehand?
We probably did. I don't remember, but I do recall that in the early years of our climbing in Rocky Mountain National Park, not at Lumpy Ridge, the bigger climbs, we certainly slept at the base of the walls where we thought we should. So later on, all in one day was kind of our preference. But yeah, we slept at the base of Spearhead, at the base of Hallett. Well, maybe not Hallett, because I don't think you could have. I'm sure we slept up at Sky Pond, at least at one point. Whether or not we did before that climb, I can't remember. But that climb took us, all day long. It was very slow. We just didn't climb that fast. We were young kids. And then at the end of that summer, on our drive back to Wisconsin, again, we returned to Wisconsin every school year. That's where my dad worked. We convinced my mom and dad to go by Devil's Tower, which is another 50 classic climb. And we were able to get up that as well. So returning to Estes Park in 1985, we just kept repeating that every single summer. We'd come back really hungry for climbing because there wasn't a whole lot of opportunity to climb in Wisconsin. There were some climbs that we definitely did in Wisconsin, but it was cold in the wintertime, and at least during high school, we didn't have access to a car to drive down to Devil's Lake, for example, which is the big Wisconsin climbing area. So we get done with 9 months of not a whole lot of climbing activity, really, really wanting to get out to Lumpy Ridge again. And we would climb as many days as we could, just, 6 days a week we would climb. I've got, again, this this diary of mine that goes back 30 years, more than 30 years. This entries in here from, say, 1985. And I'll look at these days and realize I climbed twice this day. That I'd go out to Lumpy Ridge with my brother in the morning, and then maybe he went to work, and then I'd go out to Lumpy Ridge with another friend in the evening. And, I'd do double workouts out at Lumpy Ridge, and that happened frequently. So we were climbing as much as we could and gaining quite a bit of experience. And that just continued for the next, 30 years.
You mentioned in the early years climbing exclusively with your brother,
Yeah.
and then you started to expand to other partners. Who were your other climbing partners?
It's a good question. Certainly John and I, we formed a core partnership that has lived to this day. Though he moved back to Wisconsin, he was, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to our early summers in Estes Park. John and I climbed together almost exclusively with nobody else that first summer. My younger brother, Robert, who is 4 years younger than me, he started to come on to, becoming a regular partner, but I don't think that started to happen until 1985. And my sisters, they would do a little bit of climbing with us. We'd take them out on easy climbs. And I really don't think we started to climb with other people until 1985. And even during that summer, there weren't a whole lot of partners other than my older brother John and my younger brother Robert. It was just ideal to have a partner that was immediately right there whenever you wanted to go. And climbing with your brothers too is just what a fantastic way to grow up. But I think of the people in Estes Park that were, again, these people that we thought of as famous climbers, Rusty George may have been the first person that I climbed with. And he worked at Fantasy Ridge, as so many of the good climbers did. I don't know that I could identify without looking back at my notes which climb we might have done first, but I do know that it was Rusty that kind of introduced me to Douglas Snively, who was working at Camito Boots, and he also worked at Fantasy Ridge over the years as a climbing guide. And Douglas, Rusty, and I went out bouldering one time, and I think as I look back at it, it was sort of my interview, if you will, to see whether or not I was good enough for these guys to want to waste too much time with. So we went bouldering, and surprisingly, I was able to do most of the boulder problems that they were throwing at me. And Douglas and I decided we'd go climbing one day. And I think that was 1985 that happened. Again, it may have started in 1986. But once I started climbing with Douglas, he was one of the, core figures in the Estes Park climbing. And you just started to learn all his friends. So I'd climb with Richie Dumais, Scott Kimball, Randy Joseph, Harry Kent, all these guys that we really did think of as our heroes. Anybody whose name was in the guidebook, I think I mentioned this earlier, we gave them very high respect. So when I started climbing with these guys, I was 18 years old. It just was amazing to me. It was also really nice just to be part of that older set of climbers. All these guys were 10, 15 years older than me. And there was somewhere in there that my brother and I, our work schedules maybe didn't allow us to climb together as much as we did in early years, that we started climbing with other friends. And in particular, I got a job, I think my second year in college, working at Ed's Cantina. And two twins, Chris Hill and Jerry Hill, they were also working at Ed's Cantina. And they became my friends, and Sean Preston was another Ed's Cantina cook. All of us were exploring climbing at that point, and we became this very close-knit group of friends from Ed's Cantina that went climbing again every day that we could. And we had an ideal job for it because our cook shift would start around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So we go climbing from 9 till 2 out at Lumpy Ridge, or sometimes we'd do a daring move and wake up at 4 in the morning and try to squeeze in a route up Hallett and try to get back to work. Didn't always work out. But our boss, Ed, the guy for whom Ed's Cantina is named, he was understanding. If we got to work an hour late every once in a while, it wouldn't be the end of the world. trying to remember some of the other guys that worked at Ed's Cantina. Don Otten, Dean Rohde, a kid named Kevin Sharkness came on a little bit later. So all these guys formed the core set of friends that were my own age. And then again, I was climbing with Douglas and all of his friends. And those two worlds, they didn't collide too much. It was kind of interesting that I had a foot in both worlds, but Douglas and Rusty George, they wouldn't climb with the other buddies that I climbed with. So I felt really privileged to be part of that older set of climbers. They taught me, a lot of tricks and just gave me the mileage and confidence to try harder and harder climbs.
You talked about kind of poring over the books to learn the mechanics of climbing, building anchors, and all the technical knowledge that you need to gain. But when you were with Douglas or Harry Kent, were they introducing you to some of the techniques?
By the time I was climbing
Movement.
with them, I would say that we knew how to belay, we knew how to set gear well. I don't think they would have gone climbing with me had I not shown some proficiency in that, and had a string of successes on the test pieces of the day, I guess.
I suppose, the physicality, the techniques of lie backing or footwork.
Yeah, in some respect, I'm sure that those guys gave us some pointers. And when I say us, now and again, John would climb with them too, but really this circle of friends was mostly mine. John had another circle of friends. He was a Longs Peak Ranger. He worked in the entrance booth, I think, in the early years of his employment at Rocky Mountain National Park. A lot of my brothers and sisters worked in the park over the years. So he had a circle of ranger friends that were climbers that I didn't tend to climb with, and but his friends were also kind of more experienced than we were, and yeah, I'm sure we absorbed techniques and just watching a better climber, go through a move, you're going to try the same thing. But I think it's also true that we, just experimented on our own, and over the years you accumulate tricks that work. Or magazine articles. I remember learning about the flag move where you kick your leg behind the other leg. And that was later on, though. I think that was when sport climbing started to come into the fore. In the early years of climbing, it was just, move your hands and feet up as the rock terrain allowed, and we didn't do anything too fancy. So.
Can we talk a little bit about route development?
Sure. New routes, I'm imagining you're thinking. Yeah, the progression from climbing all the routes that are listed in the guidebook that have 3 stars, and after you go through those, you climb the 2-star routes. It just becomes natural, I think, to look at the portions of the rock that haven't been climbed on. And I was certainly drawn to doing first ascents, I think partly for the fame involved, if you will. Again, these guys that were listed as the first ascents of the routes that we were doing, we thought of them as the heroes of the area, and we wanted some of that. Being involved with these older guys that did do first ascents, that was an easy route into it as well. So I think probably some of my early first ascents were just John and I, but then Douglas and I started putting up routes, and Douglas was usually the leader of those early forays, I'd say. And as far as memorable first ascents, most of my early first ascents were kind of junk piles. They were the leftovers that the first wave of climbers, or the third wave of climbers, depending on when you want to call the first wave, they were the leftovers that hadn't been done yet because they weren't all that great a climb. And I'd have to look again through my diary to just remind myself. I've done so many climbs over the years that it's hard for me to remember every route that I did, but I certainly know that after those first 10 years of climbing at Lumpy Ridge, the pinnacle of my first ascents was El Camino Real, and that's this hard route in the book. It's 512D. I think it's in my book as 512C, but I've had other people, tell me no, it's probably 512D. That was in 1992, and it was the hardest climb that I'd ever done by a long shot. I think I'd red pointed some 512Bs up to that point, and So it was a big leap in my own abilities, and to have it come on a first descent was really special for me. It also was probably one of the hardest pitches at Lumpy Ridge at the time. You know, there were a couple other 512Cs that had been established in that same time period. Randy Ferris and Mike Caldwell had put up Renaissance Wall on the book. I think that was 512C. And then there was a short little route that I think, again, Randy was involved with on a boulder near the base of the book that was 512C. So El Camino Real was the culmination of a long list of first descents that got harder and that kind of got better, higher quality. That was a fantastic experience for me.
So you did the first free ascent.
Yep.
Had it been aid climbed previously?
Yes, it had. It was an aid climb from 1980. Aaron Walters was the first descent. He may have rope solo aided it. I'd have to look to remember whether or not he may have had a partner too. Oh, I think Bob Bradley actually was his partner. So those guys went out and nailed it. And I actually looked in my diary prior to coming here today to remind myself of how El Camino Real, developed for my own. When did I decide this is a route that I should try? And my notes say that I went out and climbed it as an aid climb, looking to see whether or not it could be free climbed. So I was out, actively looking for new free climbs and realized, well, here's a fantastic looking crack that nobody has done before as a free climb. So I rope solo aided it, I think, though I may have done it with a partner, and remember it as, fairly straightforward A3. But I also noticed that this could be something that's free climbed. I saw good holds here and there and, some other stretches that were going to be difficult. So I returned, I think it was the next day, and started top roping it and realized I can do all of the moves. I was falling all over the place, but I think I linked from the bottom to the top every single move by the time our session was done that day. And then over the next few days, I determined where I needed to place a couple of bolts and got those placed, and then determined where all the rest of the pieces were going to go. When I was working on hard routes like that, I would draw beta maps. Those are just little maps that climbers use to help visualize the climb. So it shows me, the crack from start to finish with each piece of gear that I'm going to place. A little line here for the left hand and then right hand, and annotations on the beta map that allow me to sit in my chair at home and basically climb the thing. Visualization is one of the techniques that top athletes use in a variety of disciplines. So somewhere in that 10 years of initial climbing, I started to use that technique myself. And I would go to bed at night for a lot of these hard climbs and climb a route 2 or 3 times, before I drift lots of sleep. So the map, my beta map for El Camino Real, showed everything from bottom to top, how it all was going to be put together. And, I learned that out over a few visits. And once I got to the point where I could see that it was possible, I think it took me 3 more tries. Up to that point, I'd put in 3 tries, and I red pointed it on my 6th try. And it was, again, the hardest thing I'd ever done. I had met with heartbreaking defeat the last 2 tries where I had done it with 1 fall, literally in the last 15 feet of the climb. But it's such a pumpy climb that it keeps coming after you, and my hands had just let go out of, I couldn't grab on anymore. But when I got to the top of that climb, that was, just fantastic. I want to say fantastic release of emotion. I wasn't crying or anything like that, though I have cried in the mountains before. But wow, that was really something else to get to the top of that climb.
How do you manage self-doubt and frustration and fear and all of those emotions that come into a pumpy, scary climb?
Experience, I'm sure, has a huge amount to do with it, because I would say in the early years of our climbing, we didn't manage it. We were redlined on our adrenaline from the start of the climb to the top of the climb. 16, 17 years old, and our climbs were terrifying. And frankly, that was one of the things that drew us to go out climbing the next day. It was an incredible experience. it's not until you've climbed, I think, many years and start to learn how to, battle back that fear that you can start to climb a little bit more in control. And the self-doubt part, how do you battle that? That is something that is just really hard for me. In fact, when I go to a climb that has been giving me trouble, that I need to make several attempts before I red point the thing, one of the hardest things for me, the biggest fears that I have, is failure. I start at the bottom of the climb and I know it's going to give me everything that I've got because I've tried on it a few times before and I've failed on it before. And I know that's going to take every effort that I have, and that when I get to the top, I'm going to be redlined in terms of my physical ability. So doubt definitely creeps into that equation. How I overcome that, I think, again, just part of the thing that draws me to climbing is such an amazing test, a personal test. And I like testing myself, and I know that it's going to make me a better person, when I get to the top of that climb. And people listening to this interview might think, how is climbing going to make you a better person? But I am certain that the climbing that I've done and the things that I've had to overcome out there in the climbing world are directly translated to my work life, my life as a father of 5 children and a husband to my wife. That certain tasks are hard, but they pale in comparison to red pointing a 512D or something like that. So if I'm given a hard task at work, I can just look at it and say, this is not going to be any worse than climbing the diamond. In fact, it's probably going to be a whole lot easier. I'm not going to risk my life. And it just makes that task a lot mellower to tackle. I maybe strayed off a little bit from your original question of what it is that I do to help overcome these barriers, but again, you just keep trying and having success, having 30 years of succeeding on climbs, that helps, I'm sure, at least in my current climbing.
How does it feel to get feedback from somebody who's repeated that route? You catalog it as a 512C, and they go, no, it's definitely at a D.
It's, those kind of disagreements about a route's rating, at least at this point in my life, I just don't care. It's part of the climbing world. We can't put an exact grade on anything. I think maybe in my early years, if I had rated a route 511A and somebody came back and told me it's only 510 plus, that might have been a little bit of a hit to my ego. But frankly, this many years in the climbing, it just doesn't matter to me anymore. And if somebody comes back and tells me that a route that I rated 512C is 512D, I say, yeah, that's fine. It's an unimportant detail, I would say. So.
And you mentioned a little bit about establishing routes with Douglas Snively and that you would place bolts. Tell me, how did you develop these sport climbs, and why did you think there was a need to bring sport climbing forward in Estes Park?
I don't think that I can claim to have brought sport climbing to Estes Park at all. So bolting, certainly when I started climbing, was very controversial, not just in Estes Park, but in the climbing world in general. There were endless magazine articles about it. There was this event that was taking place called the Great Debate, where some of the greats in climbing, John Backer among them, I think Lynn Hill was part of the deal. They had this panel of climbers debate whether or not bolting should be part of climbing. I think Alan Watts was on that great debate. I'm just gonna get a drink of water here. So the debate about whether or not bolting was a reasonable thing, that took place, I think, in the mid to late 80s, and frankly, I just wasn't putting up new routes at that point. Or if I was, they were these unimportant little 5/8s. And Mike Caldwell was one of the early people to embrace the idea of putting in a bolt on rappel. Up to that point, leading was the sort of agreed upon ethic that if you're going to put in a bolt, you should do it from a stance or maybe from a hook and drill it on the lead. So Mike decided that he thought that was a bad way to do it. You know, that there are many, many climbs that are out there where leading them would be very difficult to put in a bolt, and he got some flack from that. There was a route out on the Pear that I remember talking to him about when I did research for my guides, and just found out, you know, his story of how this all went down, where people in the climbing community were not real happy with what he had done. But he had a very strong spine, like I think a lot of climbers. He's individualistic. He marches to his own drummer. We all do. And he had a thick skin and was able to take the abuse that he got from other members of the community. And looking back on it, he was right. You know, that there are plenty of climbs out there that demand rappelling to put the bolts in, and it's a reasonable way to put them in. I was very much against it. You know, I was part of the traditional climbing where you weren't supposed to use chalk, you weren't supposed to hang on your gear, all the rest of that. The leader must not fall. You know, I grew up with those as the rules of the game. And I don't think I really started placing bolts. El Camino Real actually might have been one of the early routes where I placed bolts. And that was mostly a gear climb. I put just 2 bolts in for protection. I think there's just 2, maybe there are 3, and then 2 bolts up at the rappel station. Most of my climbs were gear routes, or maybe a bolt, a bolt or 2 that would connect cracks. So as time went on, bolting just became more and more acceptable. And I think it was with Douglas that he bought a drill, an electric drill, and we started bolting routes together. But this was past any of the controversy, I think. By that point, the community had accepted the idea that it's okay to bolt within reason.
This was in the mid to late 1990s, correct?
Yeah. Yep. There may have been some early routes in the 1990s that Douglas and I put up with bolts. We did a route on Mary's Bust. I could look at my guidebook to find out the exact date. That was just a single pitch, and we bolted that with Douglas's drill, I remember. And I returned to Mary's Bust in the last few years, actually, and put in a whole bunch of bolts and a whole bunch of really fantastic routes, actually. But again, back in the mid-1990s, when I started to put in bolts, I just don't remember any controversy about it. So. And I tended, by the way, to put my bolts in on rappel. Douglas and I remember did a route on the Pear where he was leading and he was drilling on the lead. But that's one of the few routes that I remember putting in a bolt on the lead. And I wasn't on the lead.
Did you encounter any park rangers or any authority figures coming from the Forest Service or National Park Service who were not informed about fixed gear on rock? How did you manage that?
Actually, I do remember an encounter with a ranger one time out at Lumpy Ridge. It wasn't in conjunction with a bolt placement, but I was trying to put up a new route on the book called, The Adventures of B-Dog. And that name's got a history that we won't go into right now. And I top roped it, if I remember correctly, and then I was going to go and see whether or not I needed to put some bolts in, and it was a rainy day, so I ran out there and climbed around the backside and rappelled off. And there were some rangers at the residence out there at the Twin Owls parking lot that just lived there all summer long. And I wonder if one of them just saw me going out there on a rainy day and decided to follow me, because it really surprised me when he showed up at the base of the rock and asked me what I was doing. And it turns out that what I was doing was taking a few pitons and banging them into the rock and deciding whether or not they were going to offer reasonable protection. And that was a perfectly legal thing to do. You can still place pitons today. That's not part of the bolting ban that was enacted around that time. But he didn't really like seeing me bang a piton into the rock, and then I was banging it out to see whether or not, how well it was in there. And I ended up not placing it there, so I think he got a little bit accusatory with me. Was wondering whether or not I was banging pitons in and out of the rock in order to create a placement. And it wasn't the case, and I can understand his suspicion. Why would I be out there on a rainy day, when nobody else was going to be around? The reason I would do it on a rainy day is I do a lot of my new route I guess, exploring on days where there isn't going to be good climbing. Because frankly, doing new routes is a lot of work, and a lot of the grunt work, it's not fun to do with another person. If you're going to be, removing loose rocks from a route, for example, you don't want to do it with a partner around. And so this was just normal for me. In terms of Rocky Mountain National Park and the rangers, the bolting ban that was enacted, I can't remember exactly what year, I thought that was actually a reasonable thing for them to do. We had this situation where bolting was allowed, and a lot of people in El Dorado Canyon, for example, down in Boulder and Boulder Canyon, were putting in more bolts than what people thought were reasonable. And I think there were some routes up here in Estes Park that the general sense of the community was also, this is too many bolts, and we don't want to just pepper our rocks with bolts. So I recall for myself that when Rocky Mountain National Park banned power drilling, at least, and you could only drill by hand, that seemed like a reasonable decision as far as I was concerned. And I never had any, I never had any adverse interaction with the park people because I knew a lot of them. They were friends of mine. I climbed with a lot of them. Again, my brother was a Longs Peak Ranger, so Jim Detterline, Billy Westbay. I can't believe I didn't mention Billy early on as one of our huge heroes. In fact, I've got an entry again in my diary that I read in the last couple of days, reminding me the first time that I climbed the Diamond. And John was, I don't think, working as a Longs Peak Ranger then, but because he was working in the entrance booth, he could get a key for the cabin up there. So we got a key for the Chasm Lake cabin and scheduled a night up there. And we're getting ready to finish off dinner, and a knock comes on the door. And it turns out that Doug Snively and Billy Westbay also were going to go into the cabin. And they didn't really need to sign up for it because Billy was a Longs Peak Ranger, so he could go up to the cabin whenever he wanted to. Anyway, we ended up spending the night with Douglas Snively, who I had not yet climbed with, I don't think. And Billy Westbay, who is, among the nation's eminent climbers. And this was all before the first descent of the casual route on the Diamond for us, the first time up the Diamond. So that was a big night for us. Just, wow, we're spending the night with Billy Westbay and Doug Snively. Anyway, I knew these guys in the Park Service. We climbed with them. They were good friends of ours.
What was Westbay like?
I didn't climb a whole lot with Billy, and he was definitely assured of his abilities. I don't know that I want to use the word cocky, but he had an ego to him, well deserved. He was a fantastic climber, and I think this is kind of the way it might be with a lot of people, that when you climb with a new person, you want to show what you're capable of. And it was obvious the first few times I climbed with Billy that he was the better climber. But as time went on and both Billy and Douglas got older and I got better, they started to regard me as a little bit of the rope gun. That they would stick me on the hard pitches. And I remember going down to El Dorado Canyon, climbing with Billy and Douglas, and they made me lead the 511 pitches. So that initial impression of Billy as a bit cocky, I think that softened as I got to know him. And this is true for a lot of the climbing relationships that I've been in. That when you climb with someone that is better than you, you're initially intimidated for sure. And I think they want to show their place in sort of the status, if you will. But as you get to know these guys, they're fantastic guys. They're normal, everyday people, and they're super kind. They want to share climbing with you. Again, I feel just so privileged to be part of that older generation of climbers. It was almost as though I didn't belong because I'm so much younger than they are. But it gave me a lot of respect for what went before me.
Okay, some time has passed. You've really acquired a great deal of experience in the area. And I'm wondering, what propelled you to set out to write guidebooks of the area?
Good question. I have a very definite memory of running into some friends from Wisconsin. I might have been 20, 21 years old, And again, we lived in Wisconsin in the wintertime, and I went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison. It was at that point that Devil's Lake became my backyard climbing area in the winter months. So I knew a bunch of Devil's Lake climbers, and I was out in Estes Park, I think on the Twin Owls, and ran into a few of my buddies from Devil's Lake. And these were older guys again. For some reason, I climbed with a lot of people that were older than me. Maybe because younger 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, they didn't really start climbing. I think a lot of people didn't start climbing until they were in college or even after college. It takes a more mature kid, I think, to begin climbing. At least back then it did. These days, 5-year-olds can go climb in the gym. Anyway, these guys from Devil's Lake showed up, and we were talking with one another, and I was showing them around the Twin Owls, and one of them remarked, "You guys are going to end up writing the next guidebook," because they were impressed that we knew so much about the area. And I don't think that was the event that propelled me toward writing a guidebook, but I'm kind of surprised that that's something in my past, that somebody else saw in me. Here's a kid that is just steeped in all of the climbing at Lumpy Ridge, has made it his own, and is going to someday write a guidebook to the area. The guy was right. He could see, that would be the way things would unfold. So how it actually happened, I was always interested in writing. It was one of my creative outlets. My mom used to tell me that she just loved the way I would write these long letters, long before email. That's the way we communicated. And I worked hard on just crafting a good sentence. So I enjoyed writing, and I enjoyed writing letters. I had several pen pals that I maintained relationships with through high school and college. As a matter of fact, just writing letters to my friends in Wisconsin, because we came to Estes Park every summer and I was detached from those friends. That might have been some of the early experiences I had as just writing and expressing my feelings through writing. In any event, it was, I'm not sure of the date, maybe 1992, that Richard Rossiter came out with what he called an interim guide to Rocky Mountain National Park, something like that. The Scott Kimball guide that was published in 1986 was no longer available. All of the copies that were printed were sold out. He had moved back to Massachusetts, I think, so was not available to do an updated guide. And I think the publisher decided not to do any more, copies. Again, with Scott not there may have not been the incentive. So there was a few years when no guidebook was available. And Richard Rossiter, very talented guidebook writer for the Boulder climbing area, and a friend of mine, he put out this interim guide. And he started the guide on the first page with, something along the lines of, "I hate to make excuses, but this guide is not done." And in fact, he was kind of toying around with the project of writing a guide for the area, I think, but hadn't come anywhere near completion, and decided with his publisher they would publish something that climbers could use until a more complete book could be done. And I think his aim was to do that book, or a couple of books, on his own. Well, I looked at that book as almost an affront to the beautiful climbing area that was my home turf, and just thought, this is horrible that we've got this bad book. And I do not want to speak ill of Richard Rossiter. Again, he's a friend. We've had a very friendly, competitive battle, if you will, exchanging publication dates with the books that we published. He's actually working on a guidebook right now that we've emailed each other several times in the last year, and I'm trying to help him out. He does a great job with his guidebooks, but he'll be the first to tell you that book was a failure. It was very incomplete information. The topos were, sort of half drawn, but that was what was out there. And I wanted a better book for my area, and started to discuss that with some of my friends. And Jim Detterline was among the friends that heard that I might want to write a guidebook. And he knew of a publisher back in North Carolina. His name was Bill Webster, and suggested that I get in touch with Bill. Bill and Jim were friends. So I sent a letter to Bill Webster and told him I'm interested in writing a guidebook to Lumpy Ridge. And he wrote back and said, well, let me see what you got. I'd write a sample chapter for me. I want to see whether or not you can write. And this was 1992. Again, that's when Richard's book came out. This was also the year that I got married, in August 1st, 1992. So I don't remember the exact dates when I was exchanging letters with Bill Webster and deciding whether or not I would do this guide. But it was just before my wedding, because I do remember during my honeymoon, we took a trip up into the Canadian Rockies and a bunch of the national parks in the western United States. I penned the rough draft of the book climbs, the book on Lumpy Ridge, in the tent during my honeymoon. And my wife was very supportive of that. It's not as though we spent our whole honeymoon writing the guidebook, but I had to get some progress on it because Bill Webster wanted this chapter. So when we had a few down hours in the tent before going to sleep, I would start writing my guidebook. And I sent that chapter in. Bill really liked it, and from there it was just continue to fill in all of the blanks that were outside of that little sample chapter. I think I may have just sent in, only the book, the climbs on the book, which is probably the clip that I was the most familiar with. So over the next 6 or 7 months, that became my focus, trying to complete this guidebook to Lumpy Ridge. And it was also, coincidentally, my last year in graduate school. I was finishing up a master's degree in mathematics down at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And my advisor knew of this book project that I was working on, and he also realized that I was sort of missing some of the deadlines that he was setting for me for my master's thesis. So he took me aside and he said, "Look, Bernie, you got to choose. Either you're going to do this master's thesis and finish it, this semester, or go ahead and do your guidebook." And I realized I got to do the master's thesis. So I set the guidebook aside for a while and finished my thesis, got my master's degree. And then that spring, I was hired as a teacher at the University of Colorado. That began my career there. I'm still teaching there. But I was teaching only one class, I think. And I had a ton of free time, and I completed that guidebook. I'd go to campus and teach my class, and then I'd drive up to Estes Park and maybe run out to the ridge on the other side of Sundance Buttress just to shoot it for guidebook pictures. I took so many hikes where I would look for the ridge opposite, the wall that I wanted to shoot, and I'd run out there with a tripod, and then I took these long hikes in the mountains doing the same thing, shooting the diamond, shooting the, all the walls that any guidebook author's got to take pictures of. And I think it was another 4 or 5 months that I finally completed it all, and that first guidebook was published in 1993.
That's great.
Yeah. It was such a fantastic day, too, to get that book, the bound book. I've written many books since then, not just climbing books. I'm also a writer of math textbooks. And the process of writing a book, it's always a long one. It's kind of like climbing a mountain, actually, that you just have to realize you got to take a few steps to get this far down the trail, and it's going to take a lot of those before you can get to the top of the mountain. But if you go into it with that mindset, write a few pages today, write a few pages, the next day, you'll get there. So even though you're living daily with this book, when you finally see it arrive on your doorstep between the two front, the front and back cover, it's such a gratifying experience. So all the books that I've written, in particular my climbing guides, have been fantastic experience for me. Really fun.
It might be like that feeling of accomplishment when you finish a route and you're standing up top.
Yes, it's definitely that. And again, climbing as a way to make life better, there's obvious parallels there. That you come back to a hard climb, over and over, and you finally red point it. That takes a lot of work, but it makes you realize I can apply that same plan to other jobs in my life, like writing a guidebook or writing a textbook. So.
What kind of responsibility comes with writing a guidebook?
I felt when I wrote my guidebook in 1993, and again I updated those in 2001, the introductory material that I wrote needed to communicate to other climbers the long-held traditions here in the Estes Park Valley. And those traditions being, at least in 1993, I guess I'd have to go back and look at the introduction that I wrote in 1993, at what stage of acceptance of bolts in the area we were, and whether or not there was even a bolt ban back then. But I do remember in writing those introductions for both of those books that I wanted to communicate to my readers that Lumpy Ridge was a traditional area and that we shouldn't just stomp all over it. If you're going to place a bolt, you need to be very considerate about it. Think about the people that are going to come after. Is this a climb that's even worthy of bolts? There are a lot of climbs that have gone up that, in my opinion, just never should be bolted. And if you have a one-star bolt route, it just seems pointless to me. Just leave it alone. Bolting a 3-star route, that seems, like a worthy project. But I think these days, especially, if you own a bolt gun and you go do the work of throwing a rope over the cliff and seeing whether or not a line will go, then the decision is, I'm going to put bolts in it. For myself, I have been much more restrained in my use of bolts. I've top roped a lot of climbs that could have been new routes, but I decided this is not worth putting bolts in. So I tried to communicate those ethics of the people that came before me, of my own ethics of restraint in the use of fixed gear. Now, I'll admit that those ethics have definitely changed over the years. If you look at the routes I was talking about on Mary's Bust, there's 6 pitches of bolts. That's all there is. And I would argue that you really can't protect those climbs any other way. But that's a definite departure, I would say, from the way I felt about bolts in 1993. And I think if you talk to any climber, there is a progression and evolution of how we felt about the use of chalk, how we felt about the use of bolts, even the use of friends. When friends first came on the market, not only did my brother and I think they were Mickey Mouse, but we were not alone in thinking they're kind of cheating. That when you go climb a crack and the ability to just, boom, put in a cam and clip your rope into it, that's a whole lot different than eyeing a spot in the crack that's going to fit a hexcentric. So people thought of using friends as a little bit of cheating early on. They're fully embraced now. And so I think our bolts, they're fully embraced now. People understand that sport climbing is a valid pursuit. And people in the Estes Park area, I think, feel that the bolted climbs that have gone up here are all reasonable. But you will definitely see that, compare, say, Lumpy Ridge to the monastery. Completely different areas because of the tradition that is part of Lumpy Ridge. And people are not just going to go up and bolt a whole lot of climbs on Lumpy Ridge because I think there's respect of the area. It's also true that the rule of hand bolting very much limits how much bolting is going to get done at Lumpy Ridge. It's hard to drill a 3/8 inch hole that's deep enough to accept a modern bolt, and it's a lot of work to do that. So sport climbing is probably never going to be a big part of the Lumpy Ridge picture. But the national forest areas that surround Estes Park, I think the sport climbing areas that have gone up have by and large been a real good addition to the community, additional resource.
Yeah, what's that like to step back and reflect on areas developing like Jurassic Park or Jug Dome, places along Highway 34? What's that like for you?
Part of me feels like that story's still being told for myself. I'm not done climbing. I still aspire to do new routes. I've got actually a new crag out at Lumpy Ridge right now that I put some bolts in. The hand drilling was heinous. It's mostly a crack climbing area, but I still seek out new routes. And so looking back and reflecting upon that, I'm not sure I'm to that part of my life, if you will. It's certainly gratifying to come to these areas where I put roots in and see climbers congregating and having a smile on their face. And I love going to, even Lumpy Ridge, going out to the book and seeing at the base of the cliff, somebody paging through a guide, and it's like, oh yeah, that's my guide. That's very, very fun just to see that happen. So I'm not sure if that answers the question the way you intended it. But.
And I think you're completely correct in saying that if you were to go to any of the climbs around here and you ask a climber, hey, what guidebook have you got in your pack? It's yours.
It often is, yeah.
Yeah.
Richard Rossiter's guide is sometimes, out there too, but mine were published after Richard's last effort, so those tend to be the guides that people have right now.
And it's interesting because in the Estes Valley Park guidebook, it really is a reflection of you, I think, because you, as you described in this interview, have had one foot with these legendary climbers, and then one foot being kind of the young gun into the future.
Right.
And I think you reflect that well in the research you did for a nearly 30-page long history section.
Yeah, at the end of that 2001 book, I did a better job with that book, had more time with it, and wanted to pay homage, if you will, to these people in my climbing life that were so important to me. So I actually interviewed, I think it was 8 different people: Steve Comito, Billy Westbay, Douglas Snively, Ray Northcott, Mike Donahue, Mike Caldwell was one of them, Harry Kent, and then there's an 8th whose name escapes me. In any event, these were, these guys were the large, dominated the landscape for me as a kid, and I wanted to just find out from them how they went through climbing so that I could write this history section in the guidebook. I will also admit that the book that I referred to earlier, the Godfrey and Shelton, that very much influenced my desire to have something like that for Lumpy Ridge, because they told the story of climbing throughout Colorado, but their focus, especially in the modern era, was on Boulder, which is understandable. They were Boulder climbers, and Boulder was one of the focus points for moving forward in climbing, if you will. I wanted that for Lumpy Ridge and for my guidebook, so yeah, I interviewed all these guys. Originally, my plan was to include the entire interview, but that would have taken too many pages, so I pared it down to 30 pages. It's kind of fun to write that history and to write me into it. I worried a little bit about it. It came just sort of in the last few pages that this would look a little bit like an ego move on my part. But at the same time, I realized, I've been part of this climbing community for a long time, and I'm starting to etch my own name, if you will, on some of the stones.
What kind of themes surfaced in those interviews? What did you learn from your research?
I might have to go back to 2000 when I conducted the interviews to remember for sure. I mean, I know that I've read those 30 pages you referred to at the end of the guide. I've read those for myself many times since I wrote them. It's fun for me to return to stuff that I've written, and I like what I wrote. It's really fun to just read that 30 pages and smile. What did I learn from those climbers, though? I learned certainly some personal tidbits about their history, but I knew all these guys at that point and knew their stories to some extent. I guess I knew what I was going to hear, but they filled in some of the details and they gave me material that I weave together in the narrative that you read, when you read the end of the guidebook. So I remember, Harry Kent, for example, told me that he lived in a cave with Keith Lober. Details like Mike Caldwell ate dog food in Yosemite to survive in the early years. Those sorts of things didn't make it into the history in the back of the book, but yeah, I found out about the interesting things that happened to these guys as they grew through climbing, but most of it I already knew, I guess you could say.
One of my last questions here is, why is it important for you to get your children and your family involved in climbing?
To be perfectly honest with you, it's not that important to me to see my kids become climbers. I take them climbing a lot. My wife and I drag them into the mountains as much as we can, so I certainly want to expose them to climbing, but I'm not going to worry about it at all if they do not choose to go down my path even one step. Right now they're too young to climb on their own. Katie, our oldest, she's 16. She doesn't have her driver's license yet. So, she needs me just to get her to the climb, so we're going to go climbing. But they haven't shown an interest beyond just daddy time, really. That they love to go climbing with me, but, they're not to the point in their lives where that it's something that's caught fire for them. And I don't know that it'll ever be. I'm not going to push it on them. I want my kids to, make those decisions for themselves. On the other hand, I also want my kids to become lovers of the outdoors. So, taking them outside on hiking trips, on camping trips, on big road trips around the United States. My wife and I love sharing that with them. 14ers, we're starting to do 14ers with them. Jeremy, our youngest, 8, he got up Yale this last summer, so all the girls have been up Long's Peak. I think Elise got up it when she was 7. So we'll continue to climb. But I'm not sure I envision, say, 10 years down the road, taking Katie up the Diamond. They talk about that sometimes. Elise asked me within the last month, how old do I have to be before you'll take me up the Diamond? And I said, I don't know, maybe 18. And she kind of looked at me and said, are you going to be, still able to get up the Diamond at that point? But I'm giving her just an answer that, that she wants to hear. When she's 18, I don't have any idea whether or not she will be interested in climbing the Diamond. If she is, yeah, I'd love to climb it with them, but I'm not going to push it on them at all. So,
it sounds like, if anything, being in the mountains is in the Gillette's blood.
Yeah.
And you're kind of honoring the same values your parents imparted on you.
Absolutely. In fact, if you allow me to just say a little bit more about that, I look back at what my parents did for the children and just the family. I absolutely want to do that for my family. That my dad and mom, my mom didn't work. She gave up her career to raise the children. That once she started having children, she stopped working. She worked part-time now and again in the summers just to help ends meet. But she gave up her career. My dad had a career that allowed him in the summer months to devote himself completely to his family. And those childhood summers were idyllic. They made our family a very close-knit family. Lots of love for my brothers and sisters now. And I look at other families and it's kind of sad to see that's not maybe the norm. I'm sure there's plenty of close-knit families out there, but there's a lot of brokenness too. And the gift that my mom and dad gave to our family is special. I want to give that to my family too.
Sounds like you are. Bernard, are there any last stories about climbing you'd like to share?
We could go on for days, honestly, with the stories that I have gathered throughout my life, climbing stories. But I don't think we want to do that. So I will try to pick out a couple of points that I might identify as important character building experiences for me. I remember, it might have been 1986. I'd need to look at my climbing diary to be sure. But I went and did this route on Lumpy Ridge on Gollum's Arch Rock called Facial Hair. It was a route that Mike Caldwell had put up, and I think I came to learn about it either through Mike directly or through Climbing Magazine. Climbing Magazine used to have a little regular column called Base Camp, and they'd list the first descents from around the country. And I think that column went away when the volume of first descents that were being done in the country just became too much to keep track of. In any event, I went out there with my brother John and started to lead the climb and got halfway up. And I was some distance above my last piece of gear. And there was a bolt, I don't know, maybe 6 feet above me still, and a crux in front of me. Now, this is 1985, I think, is when the bolt route was put up, when Mike put the route up. Again, I think it was 1986 when I was climbing it. So this is one of the earlier bolted routes at Lumpy Ridge, and because of the long tradition of no bolts at Lumpy Ridge, or very few bolts, the bolts were well spaced. They were maybe 15 feet apart. So I became concerned, I guess you could say, as I'm looking up at this bolt, wondering how I'm going to piece together the moves, and realizing that every inch that I advance toward the bolt, I'm increasing my fall distance. And I kept trying this move over and over again and could not unlock it. And realized also that I don't think I can down climb what I've done up to that point. And the clock started to tick in terms of how long can I hang on to this rock face and play this battle out. You know, am I going to make it to that bolt, or am I going to somehow find the strength within me to down climb far enough that I'm not going to take a real long fall, or am I just going to peel off? I didn't have a whole lot of mileage underneath my belt at this point. This was a hard 510 for me, and I know that this was not the first 510 lead that I did, but it was among the harder things that I'd done. And I was up there for probably 45 minutes, just hanging on for my dear life, trying to get to that bolt, getting more and more tired. My calves are just screaming, you know, they're on fire. This is Lumpy Ridge, so it wasn't a super steep climb, at least not in the place that I was at. And somehow I was able to finally unlock that move and get to that bolt. And I clipped a quick draw into it and immediately, you know, descended to the ground. I was so shooken up at that experience that I went home and had a long talk with my mom and dad. I think there was some crying involved. It really gave me pause about, do I really want to do this climbing thing? Because I was scared to death on that climb. I really did not want to do a 20-foot fall through the air. Leading falls, again, were just not part of our experience. Every great once in a while, we would have a fall that was unexpected, but those are over so fast that those are the falls that aren't real scary. The scary ones are the ones where you're hanging on for dear life and you just know you're going to fall. And you know, that visceral feeling that you have, this is going to suck really bad when I come off. So I had that for 45 minutes straight and was terrified. The funny thing is, sun comes up the next day and I realized I want to do that again, because there's also this experience of something like that is electrifying. And I was drawn to it like a moth to the flame is I guess the way you could say it. My brother had an even stronger draw to climbing. He really was the guy that I think started our climbing careers, if you will. You know, he was older. He bought more of the gear because he had more money than I did. And so he had that fire under him for sure. But after that day, I knew I was going to continue to climb. And again, the funny thing is, the afternoon before, when I got home, I was still shaking like a leaf and I was about ready to hang it up. So that kind of experience has happened to me a few times afterward. It's a little bit indescribable, despite the fact that I'm here describing it to you. The words that I'm finding don't give justice to the experience that I had. And I really like that about climbing, that it forces you to go to places that you can't get anywhere else. You certainly can't get there playing tennis. You can't get there, anywhere that I've experienced. That you have to find an inner strength to overcome that, and it's those moments and those victories that I've come away from those unscathed. That's part of my character. They are character building moments, and I've had a lot of them throughout my career. So I guess we could think of some others along the way. I could tell you the time that I started crying on the diamond. Is that one that you want to hear?
What happened there?
So another story that might be interesting. I was 18 years old, and my brother and I decided that we were going to climb the diamond, that we had done enough the foreground work that needs to go on before you're going to do something that demanding. And we went up to the diamond. I think we slept up there above Mills Lake that night. Started up the North Chimney, got to the base of the wall, everything's going well. We were going to do the casual route. My brother led the first pitch, and I followed. Everything's going well. Then he led the second pitch. And in that, 30, 40 minutes that it took him to lead the second pitch, and then he hauled the bags, my mental fortitude just started to crumble. I realized that I was really scared up here, and we were 100 feet above Broadway or 150 feet above Broadway. We'd been 150 feet off the ground many, many times up to that point. But it really felt big that day, because it is. The diamond is overwhelming. It's huge. And looking up at the rest of the route just filled me with, a lot of fear that I didn't want to go on. So my brother got, again, done with the second pitch, and he dragged the backpack that we had over to his place, and I ended up just flatly refusing to follow his lead. And I started crying, actually. All my emotions were just coming out. And he, as my older brother, totally understood that he was, in the same boat that I was. He wasn't more experienced than I was. He was older than I was, but our experiences up to that point were the same. So he ended up performing a heroic act of down climbing the second pitch of the casual route, which includes that traverse, with a backpack, because we couldn't figure out how else to get the backpack down. He couldn't just lower it from his position because it was 60 yards off to my left. So he down climbed that pitch to my position, and then we rappelled off. And he was a little bit disappointed with me, but also just he showed a lot of love that day. It was a few weeks later that we decided to try it again, and that was the night that we slept in the cabin with Billy Westbay and Doug Snively, and those were good omens. We made it up the next day. So.
And that was your first experience big wall climbing, which you'd later go on to do more of.
Yeah, I don't know that I'd say it was my first experience big wall climbing, in that we regarded the North Face of Hallett as a big wall, the Petit Grey Pont as a big wall, Spearhead as a big wall. We had done all of those in preparation for the Diamond. But yeah, the Diamond's still bigger. So I guess you could say, that was definitely my first success at the Diamond, yes. And yes, I went on to climb many, many more big walls after that. It's a fantastic experience up there. It's my favorite climb, in fact. Not just the casual route, but the Diamond. I've done it 46 times now.
What's so special about the Diamond?
As life has gone on and kids and work have crowded out, the free time that I used to have to wholly devote to climbing, climbing opportunities have decreased, which I think is very normal for us as we get older. So my brother and I, some years ago, realized if we're going to have one day during the summer where both of us have off, we're both able to get away from our families, and we're going to climb together, and we're going to do something memorable, it's going to be the Diamond. There's no other face out there that matches it, within the confines of Estes Park. In fact, within the confines of the United States, the Diamond is regarded as one of the best alpine objectives. It's a world-famous wall. So to pick the Diamond as my favorite spot to be, it's just because it's such a special experience. It's, unbroken vertical from bottom to top. As you finish off the wall, there's a lot of air underneath your heels. There's a real sense of accomplishment. Some of the routes that I've done in the last 5 or 10 years up on the Diamond, they're just fun. Because I've been up there often enough now that the fear of going up there is reduced. I still get scared on Diamond days, because it is a big undertaking. But we have also just had some fantastic days where we started off on the North Chimney, roped up, and simul-climbed the entire casual route, got done in 1 hour and 56 minutes. So, other people have free-soloed it much faster than that. I think in under 1 hour it's gone. But to be able to climb at that level of proficiency, my brother and I just love that. We love blowing the doors off of the other people that are out there, to tell you the truth. It's a lot of fun to just, be at Broadway with everybody else, and then we're to the top of the wall and they're still struggling up the second pitch. It's not because we're better climbers than them, it's just that we've been up there so often, we know the routine, we know the route well. I've done the casual route probably a dozen times. So, the Diamond, you can't get that experience anywhere else as far as I'm concerned. And that's been my big wall that I try to do every single summer. I'm trying to keep the number of ascents that I have equal to or greater than my age. And I'm actually going to fail at that this year, because in January I turned 47 and my Diamond ascent number is at 46 right now. So this will be the second time in my life, once I got the number of ascents past my age, this will be the second time in my life where I've slipped back. There's good reason for it. I was in a huge calculus book project with my co-authors this last year, and we had to write 3 1,400-page books, and I just couldn't find the time to climb the diamond this summer. But next summer I'm climbing it twice, so I can get my diamond ascents back above my age.
That's a great goal. And
Yeah.
speaking of your other world, do any kids on campus ever stop you and say, you're Bernard Gillett, you are a climber?
I don't think I have the facial recognition that, a movie star might have. Certainly people know my name, and when my students show up in class and they are climbers, they will ask me, oh, you're Bernard Gillett, but it's not because of my face, it's just because of my name on the guidebook. Are you the guy that wrote the guidebook? So yes, I do get those questions from my students now and again. Most of my students don't climb, that's the reality. But I have been for the past, I'd say dozen years. I eat up some of my service hours that I'm supposed to do at the university by doing climbing trips for my students. And both of the programs that I work for encourage this. I work in these residential academic programs, which are sort of dorm experiences for freshmen and sophomores. And one of the programs in particular, they do weekend trips as often as they can. So they'll do a trip to a 14er, and then they'll do a trip to elk bugling up here in Estes Park. And one of the trips that we do every summer is rock climbing with Bernard. So I have certainly had, the gratification, I guess you could say, of students recognizing that I'm the guy who wrote the guidebook. But I've also had just the very fun experience of taking these young adults out, and a lot of them have never climbed before. We get sort of half and half. We get the kids signing up for the trip that are into climbing or just getting into climbing and really want to go, and the kids that see my enthusiasm for it and say, I'm going to try this. And we'll set up top ropes on 5.4s and 5.6s, and then 5.10s and 5.11s for the kids that know what they're doing. So I've had a few of those kids on the climbing trips that I've taken at the university. They've become my sometimes climbing partners, and I'm doing, I guess, what Douglas did for me. So many years ago, I mentored these kids along, and a couple of them have started to exceed my abilities, which is really neat to see. I need to call them up and help them drag me up. They can become my rope gun now. Again, that kind of is what happened with Douglas and me, that he started out as my mentor, and then as the years went on and I got better and he got older and couldn't climb as well, that I became the rope gun. So there's a couple of guys out there that I met at the university campus that could take that role for me. So
Thanks for sharing your stories with me today.
you're welcome. Thanks for having me.